Okay, so yeah, good evening, everyone. Sorry to make you sit in front of your computers this evening when it's such a nice, lovely evening outside, but never mind. This is the second webinar of this type that we've run. We had one a couple of weeks back, so we're ready to share with you some safer recruitment and PVG update. Just in terms of logistics, we are recording the session. We've got about 10 clubs that weren't able to join us, so we're only recording the screen share and my audio, and then if we end up with a Q&A bit towards the end, that won't be included in the recording that we share. Please use the chat as we go. We're a reasonably big group at the moment, so please pop anything in the chat as we go, and we'll come back to that. It might be that we address it during the slides, and if not, we'll get to those at the end. The content delivery is going to be mainly me talking through the slides, and that will certainly last time it took about 50 minutes, and then we had an open discussion and going through all the questions. We'll share the slides at the end. By all means, take your own notes and so on as we go. But if you don't need to frantically scribble down every slide or take screenshots, I will share the slide deck with you at the end. Matthew, sorry, so to introduce myself, I'm Andy Murray. I know quite a lot of you here over our interactions over time. I'm the Chief Operating Officer and the Lead Safeguarding Officer for Paddle Scotland, and I'm also joined by Matthew Brannan, who's one of our operations officers. He primarily deals with the administration of all the PVG checks, so many of you have sent forms to him or had emails from him as well. So hopefully between us we'll be able to answer questions, and if we can't answer them live tonight, then we will take them away and find out the answer and get back to you. So as I say, welcome online. The plan for the session, these are the things that we're going to cover. So a bit of an overview of safer recruitment and what that term means. And for some of you, this will be a reminder, and for others, this might be some new things. We're not here to tell you off of what's gone in the past, but we do want to draw a line and make sure that we're all clear on the expectations moving forward. We're going to tell you about PVG processing, and that's the real trigger for this and the change to how we and many other organisations process PVGs, and then Q&A. So as I say, use the chat as we go, and we'll try and address those. So just rewinding back to last summer, Disclosure Scotland, DS as it's referred to on this slide, carried out a review of all governing bodies of sport and also lots of other organisations across the voluntary sector into how we handle PVGs. And this was actually in the lead-in to the implementation of the new legislation that I'll briefly mention at the end. But during that review, they discovered some interpretations of the law that actually they now view in a different form. They concluded that we collectively as governing bodies of sport need to manage PVGs in a different way. We were invited to meetings in October and December last year, and I mean, we were given a very short timeline. We were given about 2 weeks to make a decision and move to a new, and eventually that's dragged on until the 1st of May because it clearly wasn't possible. There was a lot of legal review had to happen. But ultimately, these did focus around compliance, the interpretation of the law around the hierarchy of the sharing of information. So at the moment, we've got Disclosure Scotland almost at the top level. We've got volunteer. We did have Volunteer Scotland Disclosure Services. We then have ourselves as the governing body of the sport, and then clubs. And that sort of 4-tiered model is something that actually didn't fit in the latest interpretation, didn't fit with the sharing of information. So that's why we're consolidating that into a 3-tier model with only Disclosure Scotland, Paddle Scotland, and clubs. But you know, as it says on the slide, there are 8,000 organisations across the wider voluntary sector that are impacted. Yeah. So our response, and this has been something that we've been doing collectively with a number of other, a couple of dozen other governing bodies. We work very closely together. We've had various meetings with Sport Scotland, Harper McLeod, our lawyers, acting on behalf of all the governing bodies, with Disclosure Scotland several times, and as I say, sort of working groups across different governing bodies. The governing bodies haven't all reached exactly the same outcome. Most governing bodies are doing the model that I've just described and will describe for this evening. There are a couple that have taken a slightly different approach, which was one of the alternative options offered by Disclosure Scotland, which is really dissolving the entire responsibility down to the clubs and requiring the clubs to handle the data to make decisions. But that's not something that I think fits with our typical model of clubs, and that's why we're taking the approach that we have. So that's the summary. The key things that have changed, the mechanism for administering PVGs is changing and has changed as of the 1st of May quite substantially, and I'll explain that in more detail through this session. There's also some other areas that we're tightening up in the background to do with policies and procedures, and how we handle the sharing of information, recruitment of ex-offenders and so on. And this relationship between you as affiliated clubs and we as the governing body is something that's really been clarified, I suppose, through this process. So before we go on to the PVG part of it, we need to take a step back and look at what we're calling a safer recruitment procedure. So PVGs are only one part of the bigger process, and I'm going on some assumption that you've either been involved in PVGs in the past, you've been in a Child Wellbeing and Protection Officer training course where it's been explained in a bit more detail, but in essence, a PVG is only going to give you information if a person before has been caught or convicted, or intelligence information, etc., etc. So that in itself should never be used as the only part of a selection process, because there are lots of people out there that are unsuitable to work with children or protected adults who will have a completely clear PVG. So we do need to just get ourselves clear on the broader safer recruitment process. So as it says here, it's an important element of the wellbeing in safe sport. Good practice for every club to apply for all sorts of roles, so not just those in regulated work. And that's a term just to remind you all, regulated role or regulated work as it is at the moment, and that will be renamed later on next year by Disclosure Scotland. But that's got a definition. It's quite a long definition. It's open to interpretation, but that's typically people that are paid or unpaid in roles that are regularly work or volunteer with children or protected adults. So really their good practice would be that you apply safer recruitment principles to all of the roles that you appoint. We do recognise that in clubs, the nature of appointment can be a bit more vague because it's people that are in your club and suddenly they're volunteering. It's not quite like appointing somebody with a contract of employment and one day they're unknown to you and the next day they're suddenly an employee. So yeah, we do recognise that. But these safer recruitment principles must apply for all regulated roles. This isn't an optional thing. It's something that should have been happening for a long time. And we recognise that different clubs applied it in slightly different ways. Abusers do gravitate to situations where little vetting or checking takes place. So we need to be collectively and individually putting in place measures that will prevent, deter individuals who are unsuitable to work with children from doing so. And if we follow some reasonably straightforward processes, then it's given you some confidence that unsuitable people can be prevented. At a fairly high level here, a safer recruitment process looks at some things in advance of their appointment as a volunteer or employed. And there are clubs here tonight that have employed coaches or employed individuals carrying out activities, but on the whole, I'm guessing most clubs it's largely volunteers. And then there's also some things you do after appointment. So the start isn't the end of the safer recruitment process. And we want to piece those two things together to have safe, compliant club environment. And if I run through the 4 key headlines here, so number 1 is an ID check. So that's something that you have to do for a regulated role as part of the PVG process. And that actually isn't changing really. You're still going to do the PVG checks locally, the ID checks locally. You're going to ask to see the original documents or to see them on a video call. That's acceptable too. And you're checking that the person is who they say they can be. And you're going to carry that out in accordance with the Disclosure Scotland Code of Practice. The second one is around reference checks, and some clubs are doing these already. This has been something recommended for a long time. Normally we would say at least 2 references. Now, one of those could be if there's somebody that's been known to you in your club for a long period of time, then actually you being one of the references or someone else in the club would be acceptable. But you want to try and just find out where they've been before, if they volunteered with children before. And there is a template reference forum available on our website, so you don't need to go writing lots of things or creating more forms, but there's a Word document PDF as well that you can download and email off to 1 or 2 of their referees. References are, generally people won't comment negatively on references. That's something that we recognize, but it doesn't mean we shouldn't do them. And there are people that will receive a reference, and instead of filling in the form, they'll actually phone you up and they'll give you some intelligence, some information about an individual, and that might help influence your recruitment decision. The third area here is an interview. So if it's an employed situation, we're all probably familiar with being interviewed and asked questions about our experience, and that should include questions around working or volunteering with children. For volunteer roles, you can make this informal. That's absolutely fine. But some sort of conversation that just asks them about their motivations and their background and what training and support they might need. So yeah, use the word interview maybe with a small I if that's how it fits for volunteers, a sort of informal conversation. And then the fourth one here is around PVG and carrying out that PVG. This is mandatory. At the moment, it's an offence to appoint someone to regulated work if they're barred from doing so, and it's an offence for someone to apply for regulated work if they're barred from doing so. The only way for you to know if they're barred is if you carry out a PVG check. So that's sort of how you get around it at the moment. That loophole is about to be corrected next year from the 1st of April in the phase in of the new legislation, where it will become an offence to have someone in regulated role or to be in regulated work, regulated role without being in the scheme. Much like, I mean, it's not identical to, but much like if you can't drive a car without a license. So from next year, you can't be in a regulated role without having a PVG membership for the type of work that you're doing. So that's the right one there. And then there's some policies that you need to have underlining this that we'll come back to. So one of those is the recruiting with convictions or recruitment of ex-offenders policy. It's under different names in different organisations, but it doesn't exclude. And a bit of trivia here, as I was doing some reading up last week, we have a very low number of people actually in PVGs that come through that have content on them, but the population of Scotland born in 1973 apparently there's 38% of males born in 1973 have a conviction of some form, and I think it's 9% of women. Now there's, we could read into that more about what determines convictions and spent convictions and various things, but what we're saying is there's lots of people out there. We can't rule out 39% of the male population born in 1973 just because they've got a conviction. So having convictions doesn't rule them out of regulated work, hence why we need a policy called the recruitment of ex-offenders so that we know how to consider that information with the merit that it needs. Once somebody is appointed successfully, we then have a few steps to have in place afterwards, and your role as safeguarding officers in clubs should take this into account. It's not that you're going to be responsible for all of these, of course, it's others as well, but some element of induction, code of conduct, maybe some probationary period, and just being clear about their expectations, maybe some training, so child wellbeing and protection in sport, anyone in a regulated role or regulated work with a PVG must be doing the CWPS course and have that renewed every 3 years. We will help you with that as part of the standards for deployment rollout, and we'll send reminders, but just, that's something we know that there's a bit of a gap on. If they're not if they are a coach, in theory, they should have that in place, but there are people out there in regulated work that are non-coaching roles as well. And, take this with some proportionality, but with volunteers, even some element of review and support and, what can you do for their own development and as well. So in terms of the thinking as we head towards the PVG part of it, the bits that you're responsible for are those initial 3 boxes in the safer recruitment. You're going to be doing the interview, the reference checks, and then the actual PVG part of it. You have a step to play in that, but principally the PVG is the responsibility of Paddle Scotland. It's, you know, we call it a suitability check there, and that's because we're checking some other parts as well. Ultimately, that leads to a final recruitment decision, whether the person can be deployed into regulated work or not. In some cases, we'll carry out a risk assessment. We'll see in a flowchart in a few minutes. But the key thing here is that it's Paddle Scotland that's making the suitability decision, not the club. Now, in practice, in the past, the email that you would have received from normally Matthew would have said, on the basis that we've carried out a PVG, this individual is not unsuitable for the role or not unsuitable for regulated work. That's quite different from saying that they are suitable, because we've only, at that point, the only thing we've done is the PVG, which on the whole is blank. So turning that on its head, what we're now moving towards is you carrying out the initial safer recruitment stages and then telling us that they're successful, and then we do the PVG, and then we tell you on the basis of all of those things added together, the person is suitable for regulated work. So it is a different mindset, it's a different governance arrangement to what we've had before. And that is part of the process defined by Disclosure Scotland, that they need to be really clear with us, with other governing bodies, about who's making the decisions, what information might be shared. This guidance document, I'm hoping you have seen it. We'll send out the link afterwards as well. It's available on the website. This really guides you through in much more detail the arrangement between the clubs and Paddle Scotland and who's responsible for which bits. It defines regulated work. It lists some of the roles, which we've got in a slide in a minute as well, and the responsibilities. And this bit in red at the bottom, I really want to emphasize that if someone doesn't have a PVG, then they shouldn't be in the role. In the past, there were lots of grey areas. Oh, well, they can work. I'm watching them. I'm on the bank side, or I'm at the side of the pool. They're not working in isolation. We've got a case where someone dodged their PVG check for a year because the club safeguarding officer, you know, they tried to get the person, oh, send me your ID, or let me see your documents. They tried to get the PVG in place, and eventually, after a year of them being in the role, the safeguarding officer turned up at their house and demanded to see their ID, at which point the person revealed that they were a sex offender, disqualified from working with children. So people will go out of your way, and none of us want those people in our clubs, and in fact the club would have been committing an offence by doing that during that time. So we have to be quite strict on the boundaries of when someone is in a regulated role or not, and that will become even clearer from next year. So if you haven't seen that document, please have a wee read, and it will help guide you through. So this next few slides will explain that process a bit more. So Paddle Scotland is now what's called an umbrella body. That is different to the process before, where we were called an intermediary body. It's all terminology in a way, but previously Volunteer Scotland Disclosure Services, VSDS, they were the umbrella body and we were the intermediary body. And that now, with the new interpretation of the legislation by Disclosure Scotland, says that we can't have that number of layers in the chain. So we're responsible for processing the PVGs and managing the process. We're registered directly with Disclosure Scotland, which has a huge number of advantages. Actually, we can still do at the moment the free checks for volunteers. We submit the checks directly into the Disclosure Scotland system rather than via VSDS, which means that the applicant, the person that's getting the check, will receive the email within minutes of it being submitted. And the turnaround time on the PVGs we've had so far this month is averaging 4 days. And that, for some of you who've been involved in checks before, Used to be, well, it used to be months, and it's now got down to a few weeks for lots of them with VSTS. But now to get down to a matter of days, it's really quite significant. So there's lots of benefits in us going directly to Disclosure Scotland here. Really important in this is the consent. So by that we mean, in the past, clubs would send us a form, ask us to do a check on someone. We would submit it to VSTS, who would then submit it to Disclosure Scotland, and nowhere in that did the applicant agree to any of this. So there is now a step where the applicant must, through their Just Go profile, agree to us carrying out a check on their behalf and sharing the information, if necessary, with their club. Only when the consent's in place will we then actually submit the request to Disclosure Scotland. So there are two aspects here. One is you're going to initiate the check, and having done the PVG, sorry, the ID check, and then secondly, the applicant will submit their consent. It's reasonably automated in the background because they'll get an email that will give them the instruction of how to give that consent. We'll carry out the PVG and then notify you. As I say, probably 99% of PVGs that we carry out have no content on them, so it's a relatively straightforward administrative process where you'll receive an email at the end and say, we've completed the PVG, this person is suitable. It's going to be a definitive answer. For those that do have content on them, which does happen, we will, we'll explain it more in a minute, but we would be in touch with you by telephone in the first instance, and reach some decision on that. There are some cases where someone's suitability changes. What we mean by that is these terms listing or barring. So these are people that are added to the disqualified from working with children's list. If that was to happen, we at Paddle Scotland would receive a letter from Disclosure Scotland to notify us that someone is either listed or considered for listing, and that person needs to be removed from regulated work immediately. So I think, well, I'm just mentioning that in passing. I'm not going to talk too much about the scenarios that are, not likely to happen, because if they happen, we're going to be in contact and we're going to be helping you. So yeah, I've summarized the first two really quick for people to get the email and for us to get the outcome. So we can't really use time as a reason for avoiding the process anymore. This is something that we're up and running, it's live, we've put PVGs through, and it's going well. The other huge benefit is one PVG for all of paddle sport in Paddle Scotland remit. So whether someone's in multiple clubs, affiliated clubs, or we've got people that volunteer at Paddle Scotland events and level, or they're members of staff, and they're also in clubs, so we'll no longer need multiple PVGs. You, as club individuals, you still need to apply to us and request a PVG for someone. So just because they are already PVG'd through Paddle Scotland and in another club, that doesn't stop you from doing the first step, the ID check, and then the request. The reason for that is that if we get a listing or barring notice from Disclosure Scotland, we need to know which clubs they're in regulated work with in order to tell you to remove them from that regulated work. But in practice, what it means behind the scenes is we won't actually apply for the PVG in the middle. We would check that they've already got it. We would check if there were any conditions attached, and then notify you straight away. Some other changes: we no longer need secondary organisation contracts, as they were called. So these were 2 or 3 page contract documents that we had to send out every time the safeguarding officer changed. You had to sign it, send it back, and it was all a bit cryptic. I mean, lots of the words didn't make sense to many people, to be honest. We don't need that anymore. But it has been replaced by 2 separate things here, which are managed online. One is called a club PVG processing contract. So that's something that either you as the safeguarding officer or the club chair could view and agree to, and that's I'm not run through all of the words here, but in effect, that's your club saying, we will process the PVGs, we will abide by the decisions that are made by Paddle Scotland, and we will remove anyone from regulated work if you tell us to do so. So that's the club level part. And then secondly, there's the safeguarding officer part. So this is part of the compliance that we're required to do for Disclosure Scotland. So you as safeguarding officers are carrying out ID checks. And in order for you to do that, you need to agree to the Disclosure Scotland Code of Practice and a couple of other things. So the mechanism for us just to get you to agree to that is to do this credential called Safeguarding Officer Agreement. This final one, which is a bit of a challenge really, but if someone leaves regulated role in your club, you need to tell us. The practical way for you to do that is to untick in their profile. You'll see the screenshots in a minute. But if you untick that they're no longer in regulated work, that will at our next cycle, normally once a month, trigger us to send you an email and say, this person has a PVG in your club. You say that they're no longer in regulated work. We're going to go ahead and remove them from the register of regulated work. Is that okay? And we will check with you before we do it because, you know, things could get accidentally ticked or unticked potentially. The crucial thing here is we're not allowed to keep people in regulated work a note of interest with Disclosure Scotland if they're no longer in that role with our organisation, because it could lead to us receiving a notification of listing that we're not entitled to receive. So we do on a very regular basis send a list to Disclosure Scotland to unlink people. So the good record keeping is the key thing there. Okay, so we've talked about the safer recruitment. So this is for all new members to anyone that you're appointing to or considering appointing to a regulated role in your club. The safer recruitment process we've talked about already. So that's you doing the reference checks and the interview and so on, the informal interview. The next step is you're going to submit a request through a PVG credential. We'll show you a screenshot of that in a moment. So instead of filling in the Word document that some of you have done in the past, you're going to log into Just Go, you're going to click on the member's record, and you're going to submit a Paddle Scotland PVG request. In that, you're going to tell us which ID you've checked, you're going to tell us what the title of the role is, and I think one or two other things that you're going to inform or tick boxes in. That will trigger an email to the applicant immediately. So that person then gets an email to say, your club has requested a PVG. In order for this to proceed, please grant consent to Paddle Scotland. And, you know, there's a big long legal blurb that's been written by the lawyer, which hopefully they read in it, because it does lay out that actually if we're getting criminal information back on them, that we may then share that with the club. And that's, you know, one of the fundamental changes that we can't share information with you about them without their consent. If they don't agree to it, we don't proceed and they can't be appointed. So this isn't a negotiation or that we would carry on anyway. It's a fundamental part of the process is that they must give us consent. The other interesting thing is that consent can be withdrawn at any point. So they could give us consent, we do a check, and then in a few months' time, they could say, actually, I don't agree with that anymore. I'm withdrawing my consent for information sharing. And that would immediately trigger us to remove them from the role, and you must remove them from regulated work. Now, we don't imagine that's, you know, a reasonable thing for people to do, but it is in someone's rights that they can withdraw consent. And I think as this one, if a member's already has a PVG for another club, we'll do a couple of checks in the background and confirm. Club can only appoint once Paddle Scotland confirms the suitability, even if they get a PVG in another club. This is all happening really fast in the background. So, you know, we're trying to keep this moving as quickly as we can. And as I say, the 3, 4, 5 days is now what we're experiencing. So hopefully that is no longer a barrier. This isn't a definitive list, but it is the title of the roles that we've currently got approved with Disclosure Scotland. So every club safeguarding officer should have a PVG through Paddle Scotland. Club coach, instructor or assistant. Now, it's not every one of those in every club because not every club coach is involved in coaching children. So it's part of the normal duties to be anticipated and so on. But you know, in effect, this criteria hasn't changed as part of this process. Parent helpers or chaperones or committee members that are supervising regulated work by others, and then a bit of a catch-all at the bottom. Anyone who may be in contact with children under 18 as part of their normal duties. I think many of you will have seen the guidance document that we've got it originates from Volunteer Scotland. It's about 10 pages of guidance to interpret the law. In practice, this will change next year because it's going to become a definitive list of roles that will be in regulated work or regulated roles. So if you bear with us on that, and in essence, this hasn't changed for the moment. If you needed a PVG before the 1st of May, you still need one now. The ID check arrangements haven't changed at all, so just a reminder for anyone that's been involved in this before. So some address evidence that needs to be in the last 3 months. So just for the avoidance of doubt, we had someone a couple of weeks ago that asked about a driving license and using that as address, and that's fine if they moved house in the last 3 months, and that's when the driving license is dated. But for most people, the driving license is going to be dated more than 3 months ago. And on the right-hand side is some examples of the photographic evidence that can also be used. So no change to that. And when you submit the request, you will just be asked to tick 3 boxes on the online form. I'll not go through all of this. This is a screenshot of the flowchart that's in the document that I've referred to earlier. But in essence, the summary here is you as the person in the club or someone else on the committee perhaps is deciding, is this a regulated role or not? If it's not, no PVG. Still encourage you to carry on with your other safer recruitment checks to check other suitability. That would be great, and qualifications or other things. If it is, then they need a PVG. So you would then do the ID checks, you would do the references, and maybe some informal interview, and then you trigger the request to PADO Scotland, and we follow through that process as I've described already. Just a reminder, again, this isn't a change, but when you submit the request to us, we submit it normally the next working day to Disclosure Scotland. That triggers the email instantly to the applicant, who only has 14 days to fill in their part. So they're logging into this Disclosure Scotland site by this point, putting in their national insurance and the driving license and the passport numbers, address history, various other things. Many of you have been through that process already, but they only have 14 days to do it. So just, do what you can to remind them of that. And if they don't do it within 14 days, the application will lapse and we need to then take steps to reactivate it. On the whole, we're going to be on the left-hand side of this flowchart, but really the top box is saying we received the PVG certificate back. It's electronic certificates now as well, so that's sped up the process. On the left-hand side, if it's a clear PVG, which, for us, probably 98 or 90% of them are, so either it has nothing on it or it's non-relevant conviction information, then we're just going to process it administratively and report back that you can proceed with the appointment. The middle box is saying that there might be something on the PVG and we need to carry out a suitability assessment meeting. That's something we would normally do with 3 people, not just one individual staff member, and we might use some independents. We would probably, but not always, have a conversation with the club as well. So we would engage you in some of that information, but there's depending on the nature of the content and that how much we share and what's reasonable, but we try and get some input there. And on the right hand side, someone that is either already barred or considered for listing, then we would be telling you that they can't proceed with the appointment, and that would need to be the end of that regulated role consideration. This is a rarity, so I'll not talk too long about this, but there are, I think, around 4,500 people in Scotland that are on the disqualified from working with children list, and there are more people being added, as time goes forward. As I understand it, people can also be added through the application process. So they might have historic offences that won't be a surprise to them, but they're not automatically barred. They apply for a PVG and then they are added through that process. But yeah, if someone is already in regulated work and then they become listed or barred or considered for listing, then we would be notified. We would notify you, and we would remove them, collectively remove them from that role. Important that we refer to the referrals policy. So referral is I think it's a legal term, in fact, in the Act, that says that we as organisations, clubs and Paddle Scotland will notify Disclosure Scotland. We've got a legal duty to do that if an individual meets two conditions. So number one, that they've been permanently removed or they've chosen to remove themselves from the regulated work. And number two, at least one of those 5 grounds. So causing harm to a child or protected adult, placing them at risk of harm, inappropriate conduct involving pornography, engaging in inappropriate sexual conduct, or inappropriate medical treatment. So anything from the second set, and so it could be, for example, that you've begun to take some disciplinary action or you've asked some questions and they've then just never been seen again. They've run away, and you have a duty. So even if you've not gone through a disciplinary process, you have a duty in law to make that referral. We will help you with this. We have made referrals before, and hopefully none of you here have to do it. But I think all I'm saying is that be mindful of the criteria at the bottom, and if it was to happen to you, phone will help. We'll guide you through it. So how do we prepare for this? We are live. This went live on the 1st of May. We've got a few clubs underway that have uploaded all their documents, their agreements. We've got checks that have already been taken place. But for quite a few of you, you've been waiting for this evening and hopefully ready to do the next step. So the two contractor agreements that we talked about, which are the club PVG agreement and the safeguarding officer agreement. You can do both of these together, at the one time. In order to do the first one, you do need to have permissions in Just Go as an online administrator. So every club secretary has that permission, and then it's up to them to appoint the permissions to other people in the club. So if you don't yet have access to the membership profile in Just Go, you need to ask your club secretary to do that for you. If they're not sure what to do, just ask them to drop an email to hello@paddlescotland.org.uk. Get in touch with us or through the website, and we'll add it on. We won't automatically add it on if you just email us. We do need to get it from the club secretary or the club chair to confirm that you're getting access. I'll show you some screenshots of that in a moment. So there's things you're agreeing to on the left, and I suppose by going through those two agreements, we're asking you to agree to these things. So we're asking you that you are agreeing to carry out a safer recruitment process, as we've described, the ID check, the interview, the reference. We're asking you to have a safeguarding policy, and we've got good compliance with that. Most clubs have that on the record already. To agree to a referrals process if people meet the criteria that were just described. And moving forward, you will need to have a policy, which is on the right-hand side there, a referrals policy, a PVG and suitability decision-making policy. Well, that's actually that's the big document with the flowcharts in it, and also agreeing to the Disclosure Scotland Code of Practice. So the box on the right-hand side here is the things that we ask you to have on your record. Now, we could say simply that the clubs are agreeing to the Paddle Scotland recruitment of ex-offenders policy, secure handling and referrals, but we have some clubs that are linked with or exist within other organisations, primarily student clubs. We've got 9 student clubs, and if we said to them, you have to follow our policy, there is the potential of some overlap, although they shouldn't be too conflicting, that with those of their own institutions, their universities and so on. And we've also got some clubs that are affiliated to more than one governing body, principally sailing or coastal rowing or other places. So the simplest way to do this is for you to adopt the Paddle Scotland policy. And when you upload the credential for this, you can just say, yes, we as a club agree to your policy. That's the straightforward way. If you really want to create your own and approve it and put your logo in the corner, that's absolutely fine. But don't make life difficult for yourself. Try and keep this as straightforward as you can. In the agreement, so this is you as a safeguarding officer, you're going to agree to a few different things. We've talked already about the code of practice, about carrying out ID checks in accordance with the code of practice, telling us if people leave the role, and that's about you unticking the checkbox. You're going to collaborate with us. So if we tell you that somebody's barred, we're going to work together and implement that. And this thing is an over. Oh, if you leave your role, sorry, the one in the third across on the top is about you. So if you're no longer the safeguarding officer, then you should tell us. Again, that's a straightforward thing. You or the club secretary would untick that on the club record, and that would trigger a notification to us. You'll only use disclosure information for the purpose of recruitment decisions. So if we do have a conversation with you and we tell you someone's convictions, then that's not gossip that you're going to go around and share with other people. That's very sensitive information that you should only use for that purpose. Yeah, so hopefully those things are reasonably straightforward and we can support you in compliance with. Quick check here around some policies, and we will send reminders. We're here to sort of help you through this, but in terms of safer recruitment, then we haven't got this as a standalone document, but there's a small section on the website that's called Safer Recruitment Process that just lists those 4 or 5 bullet points that we ask you to carry out in the club. And also ask you to have a recruitment of ex-offenders, because that's something that you should have publicly available, or if you can, that says, here's how we will recruit people who have offences. In terms of the PVG processing, the focus there is around the referrals policy at the club level, and then sort of around that, it's about these agreements. And in terms of data handling, we already have in place, it's not something that's actively signed every time, but it's part of the affiliation agreement, is the data processing agreement between Paddle Scotland and all the affiliated clubs. So that's governance that's sort of already there in the background and has been since the introduction of GDPR in 2018. So you don't need to worry enormously about that, but I guess just have some confidence and some reassurance that we have got lots of checks and balances in place to make sure that we are legally entitled to share information and to protect that and understand our different roles and responsibilities. Here's another slide just to remind you of these things. So these are the 4 policies that we do want you to have. The third one, almost every club has. And in fact, the first 2, most clubs have already as well, because that became something in more recent time where Volunteer Scotland asked us to get clubs to have that in place. So on the whole, most clubs just agree to adopt our policy. As it says there, you can agree to you can have your own, or you can just adopt ours. Okay. So I did promise a couple of screenshots, and I said, as I say, we will send this whole slide deck round, and you'll be able to see it. And Matthew is in the background, not necessarily tonight, but he is over the next few days trying to create some short help videos as well. So for those that aren't completely familiar with Just Go, it'll help you to understand how to add these credentials, how to make the agreements, and also how applicants can give consent as well. So this particular slide is how you're going to add those credentials in the bullets, how you're going to add those 5 things in. So the processing contract and the 4 policies, if you don't have them already. So the login, you'll go to the club profile, you'll click the red box there, it's highlighted as credentials. You'll then click add credential, and then you'll search for the credential by name. You'll then get a drop-down box that will say, do you have your own policy, or do you agree to the Paddle Scotland policy? And if you have your own, it'll ask you to upload it and submit it. We have put a 5-year renewal on all of these policies. So once you've uploaded all of those, you'll get a reminder in just short of 5 years that you need to send it again or upload it again. If it changes in the meantime, you could let us know. Similar for you as a safeguarding officer, you're going to do this on your profile rather than the club's profile. you're going to click My Profile, Credentials, Add Credential, and search for something called Safeguarding Officer Agreement. You're going to read the words, tick Agree, type in or select from the drop-down box what your club is, and then submit. When you're ready to submit an actual PVG request for someone in your club, you'll log in to the club profile, click on the club members page, find the person, which depending on the size of your club, you might need to use the search box. You can type their name in on the right-hand side, or you can just scroll down the page and find them. And then once you're in their record, the top right image there is a sort of little person icon. You'll click on that, and then you'll be in their record. You can click credentials and then add the credential. So this is reasonably straightforward, and gradually you'll all get to know your way around Just Go a bit better than you maybe do already. This isn't entirely mobile friendly at the minute, so if you try and do this on a phone, it will be quite clunky. If you do it on an iPad size screen, it should work, but it'll still not be. It's not quite as mobile responsive as we would like at the moment, and that's still work in progress from Just Go. But if you can do it on a laptop, desktop type size screen, that would it will work no problem at all. I talked about the tick boxes a few times. So these are the tick boxes with the wee arrows on them. So there are two for everybody that's linked to every club. They've got this set of tick boxes, and by default they'll be member. So everyone that's in a club has the tick box for member. If you're also the club secretary or you're the safeguarding officer, those things will be ticked. But the two that we're interested in is regulated work and non-regulated work. And we do send regular reminders. Matthew sends these out every month or two to anyone that's in a club that has coaching qualifications that has neither of these ticked, because we really want you to tick one or other. You should never have both ticked. And this is just a prompt to you to say you've got someone that is a coach in your club. Please tell us if they're in regulated work or not. And that just helps to give you some assurances and also for us to have some assurances. This page is visible to any of the online admins or the club secretary, so don't feel this is entirely your burden in the club. If you wish for other people or helpers to do it, then that's absolutely fine. And you can also, you can also download a spreadsheet that will have every member in it, and all of these fields will be visible. That's just a brief screenshot to show the applicant how they would get the same process really, but how they would give consent. So to summarize, just as we draw towards an end, and then the chat's been pretty busy, we'll get to that in a second. We ask you to review your policies, and primarily those 4 policies that we ask you to have in place. And on the whole, the recommendation, unless you've got good reason to do otherwise, is for you just to formally adopt the Paddle Scotland policies for those and add them as credentials. To add your PVG, Club PVG credential and your Safeguarding Officer Agreement credential. And as I say, those are things you'll only have to do every 5 years. And we'll send you some reminders. We're aiming to have all of this in place by the 30th of June. But we'll take a bit of a view on that and send you a bit of a nudge. For some of you, you might have to have a committee meeting to agree to follow our policies, if that's something you have to do, or you can do it by correspondence with sending your club committee an email to say, do we want to go to extra lengths and create our own policies, or shall we just agree to the Paddle Scotland ones? That's something that you can take a view on in your own club. So a couple of final slides. Just briefly mentioned this already, but from next April, the Disclosure Scotland Act 2020, will take effect. There's some changes. I mean, what I've described tonight isn't really going to change from an administrative point of view. there's some technicalities around the definition. It's moving from regulated work to regulated roles, and it'll become a legal requirement. So what it's saying there is about it being mandatory rather than it being only an offence if someone's barred. So there are some crucial changes in there that we can do some more training on as we go, because we still don't know what that definitive list of roles is going to be. So keep an eye out for that. And also a brief mention, standards for deployment is something that we launched a couple of weeks back. We've had one webinar already for clubs, and we've got another one happening next week. So if you're not familiar with this already, and it might be someone else in your club that needs to know more about this, please take a look. There is an impact. I think the next slide, in fact, there is a webinar next week. Please, share that news, sign up, or encourage others to sign up. But for club safeguarding officers, actually, the change isn't significant at the minute. We expect that everyone in a club safeguarding officer role has both CWPS and CWPO in place within the last 3 years. And there is one more step that we're asking you to do by the end of the year, is to complete a free code of conduct e-learning. It's relatively short, won't take long, but it will just help us to establish some of the boundaries and behaviours. And one final thing, I promise, is just a prompt. The deadline for this is 28th of May. We've only had 5 clubs respond to the survey that we put out. It's about 3 or 4 questions long. So if you can, please just click on the link and submit. The more evidence we have, the better. No surprise, our position here is we're really fighting on this change. The proposal is to end free PVGs for volunteers and replace it with a discount, which would mean it would end up costing £28 for each volunteer PVG. So we're, absolutely against it. We're fighting it. We're encouraging them to put up the fee for the paid ones in order to keep it free for volunteers. We think this would have a detrimental effect on volunteering and on the safeguarding of young people. So anyone, whether you're a safeguarding officer or a general member of the public, can fill in this as well. So, by all means, fill it in on behalf of your club or as an individual, and give us the brief information in a 3 or 4 question survey so that we can submit our response next week as well. Okay, so I'm going to just take a quick look at the chat. I think Matthew's been busy in the background answering some as well. We'll stop the recording now as well, if you don't mind, Matthew. And let's just have a look